Marvell Cutts had been the notary public for Holt County, Nebraska for 19 years. And she said later that she had stamped a great many documents in that time, without feeling much of anything about it. Deeds, affidavits, power of attorney forms for old men who didn't want to sign things alone. She stamped them and logged them and filed the carbon copy and sent people on their way and thought no more about it. But on the 14th of March, 1989, a Wednesday, a woman named Doris Schreiber came through her door just before noon, set a single piece of paper on the counter, and asked her to notarize a signature. Marvell looked at the document. She looked at the woman. She didn't know yet what she was watching. She said she understood it later, and that when she did, she sat down. This is the kind of story my father would tell. If yours did too, this channel is for you. Subscribe, and we'll keep telling them. The bank had come to the Schreiber place at first light. That was how it was done in those years, in that part of Nebraska. Agricultural foreclosures moved at dawn, so the paperwork was posted before a family could make calls, before an attorney could get out of bed, before anyone who might complicate the matter had thought to be complicated. Holt County in March of 1989 was the kind of place where you could see vehicles coming from a long way off, flat to rolling sandhills country, the roads running straight on section lines, the fields still pale from winter, and the shelter belts of cedar and cottonwood the only vertical things between one farmstead and the next. You could see headlights a mile out in the early dark, which was how Doris knew before they were even on her road. 2 men from First Consolidated Ag Bank out of O'Neill, a process server from the sheriff's department, and a county assessor's representative there to inventory the fixtures. They arrived in 2 vehicles, a brown Ford LTD and a white county truck, and parked on the gravel turnaround near the machine shed and posted the notice of seizure on the door of the farmhouse at 6:41 in the morning. The Schreiber place, 300 acres of mixed dryland wheat and grass ground in Holt County, homesteaded in 1901 by a man named August Schreiber and worked by his family without interruption since, was now, pending final judicial confirmation, property of First Consolidated Ag Bank. There were hundreds of farms like it across that county and across the surrounding counties in those years. The farm crisis of the 1980s had been landing on families one at a time for the better part of a decade by then, and the men in the brown Ford LTD were not unusual men doing an unusual thing. They were doing what the paperwork said to do. The paperwork was legal. In most cases, it was also final. Doris Schreiber was 54 years old. She had been awake since 5, which was when she usually woke, and she had seen the vehicles come up the county road from the kitchen window. She watched them park. She watched the men get out. She watched the process server walk to the door and post the notice. She did not go to the door. She went to the bedroom and changed out of her house dress into the clothes she wore to church. Then, she went to the cabinet in the spare room where her husband Gallen's papers were kept, and she took out a manila envelope that Gallen had put there in the fall of 1976 and told her never to move, not under any circumstances, not for any reason, unless she needed it. She had not opened it. Not once in 13 years. She opened it at the kitchen table while the men from the bank were still standing on her property. Gallen Schreiber had died in October of 1986, 2.5 years before that morning. He died the way farm men of his generation sometimes died, not suddenly, but by degrees, the way hard decades take a man apart from the inside out, the back going first, and the rest following in order. He had farmed the 300 acres himself, and with hired help in the lean years, and with his sons for a while, before they left for work that paid more dependably. He was not a man who spoke about worry. He carried it. Doris knew the difference because she had lived beside it for 31 years, and because the carrying kind always leaves marks that the speaking kind doesn't. The worry in the mid-1970s had a specific shape. borrowed money at interest rates that moved in ways a man farming a fixed number of acres at fixed yields could not reliably outrun. Galen had borrowed to expand in 1972, when 80 acres of adjoining ground came available at a price he couldn't justify passing. He paid $38,000 for it, financed through First Consolidated Ag Bank in O'Neill at terms that looked workable in 1972 and began to look different by 1975. The loan had been renegotiated twice by then, under conditions that were common enough in that era and that a great many Nebraska families were discovering. One farm at a time through the late 1970s and into the 1980s were more dangerous than they had looked at signing. The variable rate clause in Galen's note was the kind of language that sits dormant for years and then activates all at once when the interest environment changes, which it did dramatically between 1979 and 1982. Galen made every payment. He was late twice, both times in spring, when cash flow pinched before harvest could close the gap, and both times he called the bank before the due date and explained what was coming and when, and both times the bank accepted the late payment without formal action. He did not miss one. He renegotiated the note again in 1980 at a rate that nearly made him sick when he signed it, and he told Doris about the new terms in general terms only, because the specific number would have kept her awake the same way it was keeping him awake. What Galen understood, and what he had said to no one except a lawyer named Edwin Prohl, who kept an office in Atkinson and who had handled farm matters in Holt County since 1952, was that the bank's behavior during those renegotiations had not been entirely consistent with the original 1972 note. Edwin Prohl was a man who read documents carefully, not quickly. Carefully, which is the slower thing and the more useful one. He had read the original 1972 note against the 1975 renegotiation amendment, against the payment history, against the specific language of the deferral clause, which ran to 3 paragraphs of the kind of prose that is constructed to resist quick reading. He found a provision the bank had handled incorrectly in 1975, not incorrectly by obvious error. Incorrectly in a way that was easy to miss and that benefited the bank at Galen's expense, and the amount of $2,340 in interest that had been calculated under terms that the original note read precisely did not authorize. Edwin Prohl wrote a 4-paragraph letter to First Consolidated Ag Bank in October of 1975, laying out his analysis and formally notifying them that the Schreiber account had been miscalculated. In his reading, to his client's disadvantage by $2,340 in erroneously applied interest charges. He requested a written response. He received one 6 weeks later from the bank's attorney, disputing his interpretation. Prohl wrote back. The bank's attorney wrote back. 3 letters. Then Prohl wrote a 4th, 2 pages. Careful language. The language of a man who has been reading farm loan documents since before some of the bank's current officers were born. He said that if the bank chose to pursue any future adverse action against the Schreiber account, he was prepared to raise the 1975 deferral discrepancy as a counterclaim in any resulting proceeding. He said his reading of Nebraska agricultural lending statute suggested that the miscalculation, if upheld, would constitute grounds for nullification of all interest accrued under the renegotiated rate, which was to say, the high rate, the 1980 rate. The rate Galen had signed in the year that felt like signing something he couldn't take back. Prohl sent a copy of the full correspondence file to Galen Schreiber and a manila envelope in the fall of 1976, with a handwritten cover note that said, "Keep this. Do not lose it. If the bank ever moves against you, take this to an attorney before you do anything else." Galen put it in the cabinet in the spare room and told Doris never to move it. Edwin Prohl died in 1981. Galen died in 1986. The men who had written those letters were gone on both sides, and the loan file at First Consolidated Ag Bank had passed through several hands in the years between, and what had been known by one bank attorney in 1976 was evidently not known or not remembered by the officers who authorized the seizure action in March of 1989. 13 years is long enough for institutional memory to go quiet. 13 years is long enough for a great many things to be forgotten by everyone, except the person who wrote them down. Doris read the contents of the envelope at the kitchen table while the men from the bank were still on her property. She was not a woman who had spent her life reading legal documents. She had finished high school in Atkinson in 1953 and gone directly onto the farm, and 31 years of farm life is a thorough education in a great many things, but not in deferral clauses or lending statutes. She read Edwin Prohl's letter twice, slowly, with her finger moving under the lines in the places where the language was technical. The way a person reads when they are determined to understand and not just to get through. She read the cover note 3 times. The cover note was plain English, and it said what it said. She understood enough. She understood the word nullification, that it meant a thing being unmade, being treated as if it had never been. She understood that the number Edwin Prohl had calculated at $2,340 in 1975 had been sitting in this envelope compounding in some legal sense for 13 years, while Galen made his payments, and then died, and that the men standing on her gravel did not know the envelope existed. She looked out the kitchen window at the white county truck. The assessor's representative was walking toward the machine shed. He had a clipboard. He was there to write down what was in the shed. The old John Deere 4020 that had been her father-in-law's, the Krause disc, the grain wagon with the wooden sides Galen had rebuilt himself 3 summers ago. She watched him write something on his clipboard. She looked back at the letter. Galen had known something 13 years ago. He had taken it to an attorney, and the attorney had put it in writing and sent it to the bank and kept a copy and sent Galen a copy and written on the envelope where to find it and what to do with it. He had done all of that without telling Doris exactly what it meant, because the specific knowledge would have frightened her, and because Galen believed, and he was right, that the only thing she actually needed to know was where the envelope was, and that it mattered. She put the envelope under her arm, got her coat from the hook by the door, and walked past the men from the bank without speaking to any of them. The process server said something. She did not stop. She got into her 1983 Chevrolet pickup and drove the 22 miles into O'Neill on roads she had driven so many times she did not have to think about the turns. She went first to a law office on Douglas Street. The attorney's name was Carl Meissner. He was 34 years old, 8 years in practice, and he had handled more than a dozen farm foreclosure matters in Holt and adjacent counties during those years, which meant he understood the terrain and also understood how rarely families arrived with anything more than distress and a payment history. He was between clients. He took Doris back to his office. She set the envelope on his desk and told him what had happened that morning and what was in the envelope and what Edwin Prohl had written in the cover note. Meissner read the letter. He read the 1975 correspondence. He read Prohl's 2-page final letter with the statutory language. He read it the way Prohl had apparently read the original note, carefully, not quickly. He asked Doris one question about the payment record, which she answered from memory, accurately, and which he verified later against the bank's own documentation. He told her he needed a day with it, and asked her to come back in the morning. He called her that evening at 7 instead, because by late afternoon he had finished reading and had concluded that waiting until morning was not in her interest given the timeline of the seizure action. He called to tell her that Edwin Prohl had been right. Not approximately right. not arguably right under one possible reading. Right, the 1975 deferral discrepancy was documented in the bank's own letters. The statutory provision Prohl had cited had been clarified by a 1983 Nebraska court decision, a decision Prohl had not lived to see, but one that strengthened his position considerably, and that an attorney reading the file in 1989 could bring to bear. The interest accrued under the 1980 renegotiated rate, calculated from the point of the original 1975 miscalculation forward, was potentially voidable as a matter of law. The amount in question, when Meissner ran the numbers with the corrected rate across the full intervening period, was not $2,340 anymore. It was $41,880. The bank's claim against the Schreiber estate was $38,200. Meissner was quiet for a moment on the phone when he said that part. He said later that he had wanted to make sure Doris understood what the numbers meant before he went further. She understood. She had already done the subtraction. He filed an emergency motion in Holt County District Court the following morning, citing the 1972 note, the 1975 discrepancy, the 1983 clarification, and Edwin Prohl's complete correspondence file, which had sat in a spare room cabinet for 13 years without being opened, and had lost nothing in that time. The seizure action was stayed pending hearing within 48 hours. The hearing came 3 weeks later before a district judge named Harold Fenner, who had been on the Holt County bench since 1971. He had presided over a considerable number of agricultural foreclosure matters in those years. He was not a dramatic man. He did not use the bench for speeches. He had read the filings over 2 days before the hearing and arrived in the courtroom with the settled look of a man who has done his thinking and come to rest on a conclusion and is now simply confirming it in the presence of the parties. Doris sat in the second row. She wore the same clothes she had worn the morning she drove to O'Neill. Carl Meissner sat at the plaintiff's table with the manila envelope and a legal pad with handwritten notes. The bank sent its own attorney from O'Neill, a man named Clifford Haas, who had handled the bank's farm matters for 11 years and who had not, until Meissner's emergency motion arrived, known that the 1975 correspondence existed. Haas argued that the deferral discrepancy was a bookkeeping variance, a clerical matter from 14 years prior, not a material breach of the note's essential terms, and that raising it now in response to a legitimate foreclosure action was a procedural maneuver rather than a substantive defense. Judge Fenner let him finish. Then he asked him 3 questions about the specific language of the deferral clause, reading from the original 1972 note that Meissner had submitted as an exhibit. Haas answered the first question fully. He answered the second with some qualification. He began the third answer and paused in the middle of a sentence, and then said that the third question was a fair point. Fenner said it was. He said it was the point that determined the outcome. He ruled that the 1975 miscalculation was material under the statute, and that the interest accrued under the 1980 note, traced back to the point of the original error, was subject to recalculation at the rate the original note actually authorized. When Meissner's corrected figures were applied, the Schreiber account balance was not $38,200. It was $3,980. Doris paid it in full within 60 days from money she had held in a savings account in Atkinson. Money she had not touched, because she had not known until Meissner's phone call that she would ever have a need for it. First Consolidated Ag Bank released the notice of seizure. The 300 acres went back into Doris Schreiber's name on a Tuesday in late April 1989, 43 days after 2 men in a brown Ford LTD had parked on her gravel at dawn and posted a notice on her door. Marvell Cutts, who had notarized the document Doris needed that noon, and who had watched the woman set it on the counter with a steadiness that stayed with her, found out the full story about 8 months later from Carl Meissner. who she knew from the courthouse. She went back in her mind to that Wednesday. She thought about the way Doris had stood. She said she had stamped a great many documents in 19 years, and that one still came back to her. She said she didn't know what the woman had gone through that morning before she walked in the door. She said she thought about it anyway. Doris farmed the 300 acres herself for 3 more years, with a hired man and her younger son Terrence, who came back from Omaha and worked 2 seasons before the ground sold. She sold it in 1992 to a neighboring operation and received $187,000, which was fair for that land in that year. She died in O'Neill in 2001 at the age of 66. Carl Meissner still practices in O'Neill. He has been at it 37 years. He said the Schreiber matter was the only case in his career where the decisive argument arrived already made, written by a dead man, sealed in an envelope, kept in a spare room cabinet without being opened for 13 years by a woman who did not know exactly what was in it, only that her husband had told her it mattered. He said Edwin Prohl had done everything right and then died before he knew whether it would hold. He said Galen Schreiber had done his part, which was to trust his attorney and keep the envelope where someone could find it. He said Doris had done her part, which was to remember. He said that in his experience, none of those 3 things was as simple as it sounded. Galen Schreiber had been gone 2.5 years by the morning the bank came. His name was on no motion. He was in no courtroom. But the 4 paragraphs Edwin Prohl had written in October of 1975 and sealed in a manila envelope and handed to a man who put it in a cabinet and told his wife never to move it, those 4 paragraphs answered the door. That is what a man can do for the people he loves, if he pays attention while he still has time. He can read the documents carefully. He can hire someone else to read them more carefully still. He can put the result somewhere safe and tell someone he trusts exactly where it is. He can do all of that without drama and without explanation. And then he can trust that whoever he leaves behind will know enough to go looking when the morning comes. Doris knew. She remembered where Galen put it. That was enough. It was, in the end, the only thing that needed to be.